Laine was still recovering after the sacred tree of life had tossed her down in this new place and phase of her life. She thought that if it had done so a handful of years before, and dropped the long-limbed Laine wearing a blue turtleneck and Mom's old fry boots next to the creek bed, she wouldn't have been able to handle it, have been given the opportunity to become this version of herself, unless she had gone through the trials leading up to it, or if she had never left her comfort zone. But the thing she most appreciated about herself was her consistency and effort, character and routine that had and was still making her a better person. She knew that this was the better version of her. If she was going to restore order to the natural world and help Cuchulainn understand Geisa and his softer side, she had to do it as this version of herself. This strange, half-wild, brave woman that contained within her all the other versions. What about her wondrous child self, who delved into her imagination to keep company, who drew intricate pictures in her coloring books, who showed Grandpa the project she made in school entitled, "I like art and reading books"? Or that self-sufficient but sad youth counselor, trying to help others while going through her own process? Or the reckless globe-trotter version, shell-shocked with grief but willing to walk it out? Or the one she was now, who developed an odd spirituality that almost seemed like paganism? She went through phases of sometimes being a vegetarian and sometimes not, and this was an internal struggle of hers. Maybe it was her fragileness that made her wish to advocate for the weaker species, especially the ones on the brink of extinction. At work, she was a tortoise hidden in her shell. She let the waves roar over her, tumbling her, but she stayed calm, and once the motion stopped, she continued to work steadily onward, having to rest greatly in her inner strength. If she looked at it the right way, these were the training grounds in which to perfect her character, overcome her temper, and finally defeat Morrigan. Morrigan was the goddess of war in early Celtic literature, and if Romulus was her higher self, Morrigan was Laine's lower self, the self that drank like a fish, smoked like a steam vent, and gave her body away to random men. But that had been before. This version of Laine gave no reaction to anyone's taunts. She was Old Stoney Face, her emotions like a stone, but no one knew the turmoil inside. She looked ahead of her at the Gate of Ulster. It was still at a distance, but she saw that the rocks in the rock wall were so tightly glued together, not even water could seep through. It reminded her of the compression bridge she built in 7th grade. Petite in stature, it looked like it wouldn't hold much weight, but under pressure it actually held up much longer than anyone thought, especially compared to the heftier bridges. It was because she built it with such attention, making sure it was tightly packed just the same as it was then. It seemed to work in her advantage to stay out of the loop, in her own little world of wonderment. But sometimes it was hard. Hold on just a little longer as you wait for the tide to flow in. Water for purification. Water to bring a rich, bountiful harvest. You have what you need and must produce with what you have. No excuses. The scientist she mentioned earlier spoke about tree lines. Think about the biodiversity in the old-growth forests, he said. You can't get that from just planting trees. Everything works together to add to these vibrant old-growth communities. He said it was better to preen a bit from here and there, take only what's needed. Laine didn't know much about that, but she did know how hard it was to let go and let grow. The way we humans love to check up on things, plan, and otherwise control outcomes. It helps us feel safe. And yet there is something larger at play, which we must surrender to if we are to find peace and growth. Still, the dis-ease started to surface inside her, and she forgot about her land of ease, her inner peace, when she thought about working at the movie theater. Would the water she floated on, which was her part-time job, while working to make a living as a writer, tear her apart? Dante Alighieri said something about earning a living was what one did to survive, but making a life is all about what one has to contribute. This was the flow of least resistance she'd chosen for herself. As much as it hurt her, she thought that having a low-key minimum wage job would help her focus on what really mattered to her art and writing. This is if she survived. She learned in her research that some bodies left in the water after death were dismembered by the rivers if the animals didn't pick them apart first. Any form of decomposition that was considered disturbed or deviated from the natural course of things was determined to be worth exploring. I guess so, Laine thought. But when it came to her dismemberment, it probably made no sense to talk about what she'd gone through or was currently going through, except maybe to help someone. Once she'd lost her hat on a kayak trip with Dad. They parked in North Missoula and were supposed to float down till they got to the main Clark Fork as it entered Bonner, but Dad hadn't expected the old town mill to cut off the river in one section. They had to climb up a steep cliff and walk the rest of the way to Bonner truck stop, where they ate burritos. Her kayak flipped in the rapids and she lost her little fishing hat. It was exciting looking back, but at the time she was probably a little terrified, so maybe now it was like it had been then. She liked a little danger. It made things fun, like doing winter hikes in Montana. She had half a mind to tell someone off. Thank goodness it was only half a mind, and she became better at managing her temper. Plus, that research she did was about dead people from the ancient past. She was very much alive, so far. Sometimes when the energies around her felt at their heaviest, she imagined herself sitting on a rock next to a faraway city that was just across the water.
Artlist.io.
Successful people are patient and enduring. She saw a billboard that said women retire with far less money than men. Hardly ever was anything completely fair, but she thought, it is still good. She was lucky to have come this far. This was the path of least resistance that the shark spirit followed. And she was like the shark, who is full of deep emotions, but careful not to let them show. But still, her dreams led her on. Nothing else seemed to matter as much. When caterpillars stretch into butterflies, weren't their parts a little dislocated too? Like they'd been born with all their adult parts, which were on pause developmentally until the juvenile processes were done. She had to try and make something from the talent she'd been given, and stop moaning. Just suck it up. She looked around her at the coins on the ground. Had Mertis tossed them in after her, so she could adorn herself more? Had she manifested money? If so, she'd invest in her business to make better videos. Maybe eventually hire a small team, or have people that could work for her. But it seemed the majority of wealth would manifest sometime down the road if she continued at a slow but steadfast pace. Even so, she was quick to grab up what coins she could before she heard voices. For some reason in that moment, Laine thought about Sally, the youth counselor from India. Sally and Marilyn were the two mature female staff who the kids respected. Laine was more like an older sister, so her authority was somewhat less. Laine didn't tell Sally that she liked to learn about Eastern religions and philosophies, but she did let her read some of her work one time. Sally had said, "It is good, but of course there are a few improvements to be made." Laine was thinking, Lakshmi was born from the churning of the primordial ocean. She rose out of the turmoil of the waters on a lotus, surrounded by honeybees and budding flowers. Lakshmi inspires us to contemplate the double meaning of abundance, abundance in the material and spiritual realms. Lakshmi is the goddess of prosperity, but earned prosperity. Celebrating Lakshmi is celebrating hard work and earned success. She is on the side of honest, good, and hardworking. Lakshmi teaches us that good luck doesn't come to those who wait, but to those who work for it and invite it into their lives by positive actions. It was just her luck that she would wake up on one of the rare archaeological sites that existed from the Iron Age. Next to it was an extensive ditch and creek bottom laying at her feet. She heard a low bellowed moan. "What was that?" she asked, but everyone knew what that sound was. From above she saw the top of a person's head. The tent they came out of was no more than 30 feet away. Gwen's long hair fell forward as she plucked one of her moccasin boots from the outside of the tent. She was holding a piece of cloth over her breast, but she stayed where she was. "Fergus, I think someone may have heard us," she said. Laine still wore her Roman day sheets, which she thought looked pretty stretched around her even though she was tired as hell. She saw two figures in the distance, frightened at the sight of her. "Who is it?" he asked. The one coming near her was Frank, her past co-worker at the sea home. He was pulling on his tunic. He wore a long-sleeve hide covering with a drawstring that wove in and out from his chest. Both the shirt and breeches were a woolly gray color. His thick hair came up in a crow's peak, almost in the same shape as his helmet, and his hair was a flaming red. She wondered if she had screamed on the way down, if that's how they had been alerted to her presence, or if they'd somehow caught wind of her siren song. Either way, Laine could not believe she had just caught her former boss and co-worker coming off the act. Or was it still in her imagination? She didn't know. Maybe he really had painted her house after all. Laine wasn't shocked because she knew Fergus was Frank and Maeve was Gwen, like in the story of the cattle raid.
Artlist.io.
Why do you try to waken memory? Why talk about the days that used to be? You say you love me, but you know that's not true. I can't forget the tears
Thanks for watching my video, guys. I'll be back with another video next Wednesday. Until then, ciao!